people are currently perhaps unwilling to accept, but when they're cold and hungry and desperate,
you're exactly right.
I think that some people will be more willing.
Do slaves still exist? In a recent interview with Whitney Webb, she talked about how elites have created a class of modern slaves, and these are no other than Africans. As heart-wrenching as it sounds, the West is still having control over African nations in a way that doesn't look like a slave-master relationship. But if you look deep, you understand how this is the creation of a slave class.
You're not improving my mood much.
Well, it's we have to understand what we're facing in order to, solve it.
But how is this happening on a deeper level? Who is responsible? Let's find out. History of exploitation repeats itself, where strategies of domination and control evolve yet rarely disappear. In the modern era, a new form of enslavement is appearing, specifically targeting Black Africans. This insidious process leverages historical exploitation, economic dependency, technological surveillance, and socio-political manipulation. Despite the end of colonial rule, many African nations remain trapped in cycles of dependency and exploitation. Elites utilize various methods to perpetuate these cycles, ensuring that Black Africans remain subservient and deprived of true autonomy and prosperity.
In my idealistic years of thinking about America, I thought, well, we did some bad things, yes, and I'm not talking about slavery or anything else. I'm talking about things we did in war. Mm-hmm. But we had, we really didn't want to do those things. I'm not sure if any of that is true. Are the people involved in this stuff, do they recognize at all that this is evil, or is this just business?
Well, I think when you're talking about intelligence agencies, there's hierarchies. So there's people maybe low in different levels that may think what they're doing is right and advancing American interests. But then there's people at the top that aren't necessarily like that, and it's about advancing their own interests.
But how did modern exploitation become possible in Africa? The seeds of modern exploitation were sown during the colonial era, when European powers ruthlessly exploited African resources and labor. The legacy of colonialism is deeply entrenched in the economic and social fabric of African nations. During the colonial period, European powers established systems of extraction and control that systematically stripped the continent of its wealth. Resources such as minerals, agricultural products, and human labor were exported to Europe, while African economies were deliberately kept underdeveloped. Many African nations remain economically tethered to their former colonizers, despite political independence. This neo-colonial dependency is perpetuated through unfair trade agreements, crippling debt, and economic policies imposed by international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. These mechanisms ensure that African nations remain subservient, unable to break free from the chains of their colonial past. Unfair trade agreements often favor Western countries, allowing them to extract resources at low costs while selling manufactured goods at higher prices. This trade imbalance keeps African economies dependent on exporting raw materials rather than developing their industries. For example, African countries export vast amounts of raw cocoa, while Western companies process the cocoa into high-value chocolate products, retaining most of the profits. Crippling debt is another tool of economic control. Many African nations are burdened with high-interest loans and stringent conditions imposed by international lenders. These loans often prioritize debt repayment over essential services like healthcare and education, perpetuating poverty and instability. The structural adjustment programs (SAPs) imposed by the IMF in the 1980s and 1990s forced many African nations to cut public spending, leading to deteriorating public services and increased poverty. Economic policies imposed by international financial institutions often favor neoliberal principles, promoting privatization and deregulation. These policies can undermine local economies and increase inequality, ensuring that African nations remain dependent on external powers. For instance, the privatization of state-owned enterprises often leads to job losses and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, exacerbating social inequalities.
if you look at a lot of controversial intelligence operations and decisions, coups, for example, of the past, a lot of it was justified as going against communist influence, trying to keep that from growing. But then some of these same actors, like the Iran-Contra types, they ended up getting involved with the Chinese government just a few years later in the 1990s, and some of this blossomed into what a lot of conservatives today remember as Chinagate during the Clinton administration and things like that. So, they really have no allegiance to anything except their desire to grow their own money and power.
We need to address in detail how debt and financial control perpetuate African dependency. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Debt burdens many African nations, trapping them in a cycle of dependency. High-interest loans and stringent conditions imposed by international lenders strip countries of their economic sovereignty. This financial stranglehold forces African nations to prioritize debt repayment over essential services, perpetuating poverty and instability. Debt traps create a situation where countries must continually borrow to pay off existing debts, leading to a vicious cycle of borrowing and repayment. This cycle ensures that nations remain vulnerable to external manipulation and control, as they must comply with the demands of their creditors. For example, Zambia's debt crisis in recent years has led to severe austerity measures, causing public sector job cuts and reductions in social services. Resource exploitation is another significant factor. Africa's rich natural resources are a double-edged sword. While they hold the potential for prosperity, they are often the source of exploitation. Multinational corporations, frequently backed by Western powers, extract vast wealth from African soil with minimal benefit to local populations. This resource extraction enriches the elites while leaving the masses impoverished and dependent on the systems that exploit them. Local communities often face environmental degradation and loss of livelihoods due to resource extraction. The wealth generated from these resources rarely benefits the local population, as profits are often repatriated to multinational corporations' home countries. For example, in the Niger Delta, oil extraction has led to severe environmental damage, while local communities remain impoverished and lack basic services. Economic policies imposed by international financial institutions, such as the IMF and World Bank, often prioritize market liberalization and deregulation. These policies can undermine local industries and increase inequality, ensuring that African nations remain dependent on external powers. For instance, the liberalization of agricultural markets has led to the collapse of local farming industries, as small-scale farmers struggle to compete with heavily subsidized imports from Western countries. Neo-colonial practices also manifest in the form of land grabs, where foreign companies and governments acquire large tracts of land for agricultural or industrial use. These land deals often displace local communities and deprive them of their livelihoods. In countries like Ethiopia and Mozambique, large-scale land acquisitions by foreign investors have led to conflicts and displacement of rural populations.
Are we ever going to find out who's in the Black Book?
I don't think so. I think the FBI has been compromised from the very beginning. In the book, I talk a lot about J. Edgar Hoover. He was blackmailed by the mob. He realized the power blackmail had, started using blackmail himself. Increasingly the FBI, and I think it's very obvious to a lot of conservatives now, comes in to cover things up and to, go after, figures that they, don't want to advance in their careers or, any sort of thing.
But how is the West deepening its control on Africa? The dominance of Western technology companies in Africa's digital infrastructure paves the way for extensive surveillance and control. By controlling internet services and data storage, these companies can monitor communications and suppress dissent. This digital colonialism ensures that any resistance to external control is swiftly identified and neutralized, further entrenching the power of the elites. Biometric identification systems and AI-driven surveillance technologies are being implemented under the guise of improving security and service delivery. However, these technologies can be exploited to monitor and control populations. Political opponents, activists, and dissenters can be easily targeted, silencing resistance and ensuring compliance with the interests of the elites. Digital colonialism extends to the control of social media platforms and online content. By manipulating algorithms and censoring dissenting voices, elites can shape public perception and maintain control over the narrative. For example, social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter have been accused of censoring content critical of Western policies or exposing human rights abuses in Africa. Surveillance technologies, such as facial recognition and biometric databases, are increasingly used by African governments with support from Western and Chinese companies. These technologies, ostensibly introduced to improve public safety, can be used to track and suppress political opposition and social movements. In countries like Zimbabwe and Uganda, biometric voter registration systems have been criticized for disenfranchising opposition supporters and manipulating electoral outcomes. The integration of AI-driven surveillance systems allows for more sophisticated monitoring of populations. These systems can analyze vast amounts of data to identify potential threats and predict social unrest. However, the use of such technologies raises significant concerns about privacy and human rights. In Ethiopia, the government's use of surveillance technology to monitor political opponents and activists has been widely documented. Western technology companies also play a crucial role in shaping Africa's digital economy. By providing essential services like internet access and cloud storage, these companies gain significant control over the continent's data. This control can be used to exert economic and political influence, as seen in cases where tech giants like Google and Facebook have been involved in lobbying and influencing policy decisions in African countries.
It's
crazy. How much of what we think we know is wrong, or how big of a role is what we think we know to what really is happening?
Well, I think there's been a major effort to control the media and how much information gets to the American public about all sorts of things.
How do controlled narratives and media manipulation reinforce external control? The media, both local and international, is a powerful tool for shaping public perception. By controlling the narrative, elites can justify their actions and obscure their true intentions. Disinformation campaigns create divisions within societies, weakening national unity and making populations more amenable to external control. The portrayal of African nations as chaotic and in need of intervention serves to legitimize external manipulation. Controlled narratives ensure that the actions of external powers are portrayed in a positive light, while resistance and dissent are described as dangerous or illegitimate. This manipulation of public perception makes it easier to justify interventions and maintain control over African nations. For example, media portrayals of conflicts in Africa often emphasize tribal violence and corruption, ignoring the external factors that contribute to these issues. Political instability is another tactic used to maintain control. By supporting corrupt leaders or fomenting instability, external powers ensure that African nations remain chaotic and dependent on foreign aid and military support. This instability makes it difficult for nations to develop independently, further entrenching their reliance on external powers. In countries like Libya and Sudan, external interventions have contributed to prolonged conflicts and political instability. Disinformation campaigns are often used to manipulate public opinion and create divisions within societies. By spreading false information and conspiracy theories, elites can create confusion and mistrust, weakening social cohesion and making populations more susceptible to external influence. For instance, during elections in several African countries, disinformation campaigns have been used to discredit opposition candidates and undermine democratic processes. Media ownership and control also play a significant role in shaping public perception. In many African countries, media outlets are owned or influenced by political elites and external powers. This control over media ensures that certain narratives are promoted while others are suppressed. For example, in Rwanda, the government maintains strict control over the media, using it to promote its policies and suppress dissenting voices. International media organizations also contribute to shaping perceptions of Africa. Western media often portrays Africa in a negative light, focusing on conflicts, poverty, and disease while ignoring the continent's achievements and potential. This negative portrayal reinforces stereotypes and justifies external interventions. The focus on sensational news stories overlooks the complexities and nuances of African societies, perpetuating a one-dimensional view of the continent.
I do think that there is real evil at the upper levels that we've been engaging in, and all of us dupes out in the center of the country are like, oh no, how prevalent is the massive corruption and the evil with.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, the more you look at the people that were around Epstein, even before Epstein gets involved, it becomes very clear that what he was doing was not out of the ordinary.
How do modern slavery and labor exploitation continue to affect African populations? Modern forms of slavery, including forced labor and human trafficking, continue to plague Africa. Weak governance and corrupt systems allow traffickers to operate with impunity, exploiting vulnerable populations. This modern slavery is often hidden behind layers of subcontracting and outsourcing, making it difficult to hold corporations accountable. Exploitation in global supply chains is another significant issue. African labor is frequently exploited in industries such as mining for conflict minerals and agricultural work. This exploitation is driven by multinational corporations seeking to maximize profits at the expense of local workers. The exploitation is perpetuated by complex supply chains that obscure the true conditions under which African laborers work. Labor exploitation is often justified by the need for cheap goods and services in Western markets. This demand for low-cost products drives the exploitation of workers, who are often paid meager wages and work in dangerous conditions. For example, cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo involves child labor and hazardous working conditions. Yet cobalt is essential for the production of smartphones and electric vehicles. Human trafficking is another form of modern slavery that affects African populations. Traffickers exploit vulnerable individuals, often promising them better opportunities abroad, only to subject them to forced labor or sexual exploitation. The lack of robust legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms in many African countries allows traffickers to operate with relative impunity. In Libya, migrants and refugees face severe exploitation and abuse at the hands of traffickers and militias. Forced labor is also prevalent in various sectors, including agriculture, construction, and domestic work. Migrant workers in particular are vulnerable to exploitation due to their precarious legal status and lack of protection. In countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, African migrant workers often face harsh working conditions, non-payment of wages, and physical abuse. The informal economy in Africa is another area where labor exploitation is rampant. Informal workers often lack legal protections and are vulnerable to exploitation by employers. Women and children are particularly affected, as they are often employed in low-paying, precarious jobs with little to no job security. In Nigeria, for example, the informal economy accounts for a significant portion of employment, yet workers in this sector face numerous challenges, including low wages and lack of social protections.
Especially like arms dealers, like Adnan Khashoggi, he had an alleged harem of women that he used to blackmail powerful people in the private and public sectors on his yacht, and all other sorts of types of people. Robert Keith Gray, a PR executive that started working for Adnan Khashoggi around the same time Jeffrey Epstein allegedly did, has an alleged history of sexual blackmail for the CIA. And then you have allegations of Roy Cohn, the well-known New York mob attorney, also being involved in sexual blackmail stuff, begins working for Adnan Khashoggi in the same period of time in the 1980s. I mean, the more you look, it's prevalent. But, how prevalent it is, I can't really say, but it definitely does influence our politics, and that's disturbing.
Beyond labor exploitation, sociocultural manipulation further entrenches dependency and control. So, how does sociocultural manipulation maintain control over African populations? Sociocultural manipulation involves the deliberate shaping of cultural and social norms to maintain control over populations. This manipulation can take various forms, including the promotion of Western values, the erosion of traditional cultures, and the use of public health interventions for control. Through the promotion of Western values and lifestyles, traditional African cultures and identities are being eroded. This cultural imperialism creates a sense of inferiority and dependency on Western ways of life. The loss of cultural identity weakens societal cohesion, making it easier for external powers to impose their will. For example, the widespread adoption of Western clothing, language, and education systems can undermine local traditions and practices. Public health interventions, ostensibly aimed at improving health outcomes, can be manipulated to control populations. Vaccination campaigns and disease prevention programs can be used to gain access to biological data and exert control over reproductive rights and population growth. This biopolitical control ensures that African populations remain manageable and compliant. For instance, family planning programs can be used to influence population dynamics, often with little regard for local cultural and social contexts. The promotion of Western education systems can also play a role in sociocultural manipulation. By prioritizing Western curricula and values, these education systems can undermine local knowledge and traditions. This can create a generation of Africans who are disconnected from their cultural heritage and more aligned with Western ideologies. The emphasis on English or French as the medium of instruction in many African countries further reinforces this disconnect. Religious manipulation is another tactic used to maintain control. External powers can support certain religious groups or leaders to promote specific agendas. This can create divisions within societies and weaken national unity. In countries like Nigeria, the influence of foreign religious organizations has contributed to sectarian conflicts and social tensions. Media and entertainment also play a significant role in shaping cultural norms and values. The dominance of Western media content, including movies, music, and television shows, can influence local cultures and promote Western lifestyles. This can create a sense of cultural inferiority and drive the adoption of Western norms and values at the expense of local traditions.
There are big things on the table that no one's talking about. And
we're all focused on the little stuff they've used to divide and conquer us this whole time. And big things are happening, and basically we are being herded into a techno-feudalism, slavery. I don't know, there's a lot of different names for it going around, but it's not good.
Right.
And it's organized crime, running the show.
At the highest levels, and also evil. I mean, it's just getting so dark.
Do legal and political coercion tactics reinforce external control over African nations? Legal and political coercion involves the manipulation of legal systems and political structures to favor external interests. This can be achieved through lobbying, legal threats, and the installation of compliant political leaders. External powers can influence the legal and judicial systems in African countries to favor their interests. Lobbying for laws that benefit multinational corporations or using legal threats to silence opposition ensures that African nations remain subservient. For example, foreign companies may lobby for favorable mining laws that allow them to extract resources with minimal regulation and oversight. This legal manipulation ensures that local communities do not benefit from their natural resources. Political puppetry is another tactic used to maintain control. By supporting and installing compliant political leaders, external powers can ensure that African nations remain under their thumb. These leaders prioritize foreign interests over national interests, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and exploitation. In countries like Uganda and Rwanda, leaders who align with Western policies receive significant support, while those who resist face sanctions and political isolation. Corruption is often used as a tool of political coercion. External powers can exploit corrupt officials to further their interests, providing financial incentives or political support in exchange for favorable policies. This corruption undermines democratic processes and weakens governance, making it easier for external powers to exert control. In countries like Kenya and Nigeria, corruption scandals involving foreign companies and local officials have highlighted the pervasive influence of external powers. Military interventions and support are also used to reinforce external control. By providing military aid and training to African governments, external powers can influence domestic security policies and maintain strategic alliances. This military support can be used to suppress dissent and opposition, ensuring that compliant regimes remain in power. In countries like Mali and Somalia, foreign military interventions have shaped local security dynamics and influenced political outcomes. Legal frameworks and international agreements can also be used to exert control. Trade agreements, investment treaties, and bilateral agreements often include provisions that favor external powers and limit the sovereignty of African nations. These agreements can impose restrictions on local industries, prioritize foreign investors, and limit the ability of governments to regulate their economies. For example, investment treaties often include clauses that allow foreign companies to sue governments for policies that affect their profits, undermining national sovereignty.
A lot of us are sort of fed this, when we're in school and stuff, sort of this naive, I guess you could call it a fairy tale version of history where there's no corruption, everything's fine, the mob disappeared decades ago, nothing to see here, but that's not the real history of this country.
But what strategies can African nations adopt to resist external control and empower their populations? Resisting external control and empowering African populations requires a multifaceted approach that addresses the root causes of dependency and exploitation. This approach involves economic reforms, strengthening governance, promoting cultural resilience, and building international solidarity. Economic reforms are essential for reducing dependency on external powers. African nations can prioritize developing local industries, diversifying their economies, and reducing reliance on exporting raw materials. Investing in education and skills development can also enhance local capacities and reduce the need for foreign expertise. Additionally, renegotiating unfair trade agreements and seeking debt relief can help restore economic sovereignty. Strengthening governance and combating corruption is critical for reducing external influence. Transparent and accountable institutions can prevent the exploitation of resources and ensure that public funds are used for the benefit of the population. Strengthening legal frameworks and judicial systems can also protect national interests and prevent manipulation by external powers. Promoting cultural resilience involves preserving and revitalizing traditional cultures and values. This can be achieved through education systems that incorporate local knowledge and languages, as well as media and entertainment that reflect African identities. Supporting local artists, writers, and cultural practitioners can help promote a sense of pride and resilience in African cultures. Building international solidarity is crucial for resisting external control. African nations can strengthen regional cooperation through organizations like the African Union. By working together, African countries can present a united front in negotiations with external powers and support each other in times of crisis. Additionally, forming alliances with other developing regions can enhance collective bargaining power and promote a more equitable global order. Civil society organizations and grassroots movements play a vital role in resisting external control. These organizations can raise awareness, mobilize communities, and advocate for policy changes that promote national sovereignty and social justice. Supporting the work of local NGOs, activists, and community leaders can amplify the voices of marginalized populations and ensure that their interests are represented. In the end, the creation of a new class of slaves among Black Africans is a process that leverages historical exploitation, economic manipulation, technological control, and socio-political coercion. By perpetuating dependency, exploiting labor, and undermining sovereignty, the elites can maintain a system where Black Africans remain subservient and deprived of true autonomy and prosperity. Do you think it can be fought? Will locals getting up against it be enough to end modern slavery? Let us know in the comments section. What other proof the world needs to believe that the West is still trying to own slaves? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.